Nick Adams from AME Cloud Partners, and Dixon Doll from Impact, and finally Carmen Chang from NEA. Now, they are all represented in the book because there's a venture capital chapter in the book which talks about the evolution of venture capital in the market and how it grew up, who the pioneers were, and who were the survivors. So we have a number of survivors here. These are all survivors. So I would like each one of you to offer your perspective on what you see as some of the leading trends, and including the US-China tech Cold War. How do you see that playing out, and how you see it impacting venture capital? So Wei, why don't we start with you, and you could give a little intro about who you are and what you do, and also your perspective on the US-China tech Cold War.
Okay.
Oh, we need, does everyone have mics? Eric, what happened to the other mic?
Got it. Okay.
I didn't see it, I had to shift seats.
Okay, we got it. Great. Hello. So my name is Wei Jiang. Currently I'm working with a early stage fund called ZhenFund, and I'm also in parallel setting up a separate fund that's called Momentor. The reason is mainly because the CFIUS reform law that foreign fund will have much bigger challenges investing in the US. And before that, I worked in the US and then also in China. Some of the examples that Rebecca mentioned, I lived through. For example, I worked at eBay in China, and we competed against Alibaba for, I was there for about 2 years. So a lot of scars to show, and interesting stories to share maybe. And then later I had my startups. I competed against one of the largest companies in my space from the US. We were somewhat successful to kind of chase them out of China. And then after that, I took on an advisor position at Google China, and later on became the chief marketing officer at Greater China. So I started doing venture investing 3 years ago with ZhenFund. So that's briefly my background. I lived through some experience, working in the US companies, fighting against local competitors. In the case of eBay, that would be Alibaba, Taobao. In the case of Google, that'd be Baidu and a bunch of others. Also, I try to play the role of a local competitor against international companies. So to answer Rebecca's question, the way I look at the current situation is it's pretty intense. So as you can tell, right, my employer, ZhenFund, which is one of the top early stage funds, can no longer invest directly in here, or practically can no longer invest. So we do have a significant portfolio in the US. So that's a big change. That's like an earthquake for us. In terms of how I see the future, I see that China being a big country with a lot of consumers, and China has built good infrastructure in the past few decades. And China's consumers are just very curious. They embrace new things, new technology, new products, like no other consumers I have seen. We had some internal data to compare when I worked at Google. So I'll give you a couple examples, a couple data points. For Chinese users, Android phone users, which Android was 80% of market share in China. So 50% of these guys would switch new phone, hardware phone, every 6 months. So in comparison, in US, that's about a year and a half. And regular Chinese consumers would have 15 most commonly used apps on their phone. So the definition is, within a week, you have to open it like 5 times and so many minutes. And then in comparison, US consumers will have like 5 to 7 commonly used apps. So they also spend a lot of money, and they also borrow a lot of money. So Chinese consumers are the source of power that pushing the Chinese startups to do different things.
All right. Good. David?
Good evening. My name is David Lamb. I'm a general partner at Atlantic Bridge. We are a U.S.-Europe cross-border fund. We operate three fund strategies. The first and flagship fund for about 15 years is an investment strategy between the U.S. and Europe, building cross-border networks, all focused on B2B technologies, AI, semiconductors, and cloud and big data. We also have, for the last 7 years, invested a China-Europe strategy co-sponsored by 2 sovereign wealth funds, one in China and one in Europe, and that is also focused on those same sectors, in addition to some other broader industrial sectors, and then we have an early-stage seed fund. Prior to Atlantic Bridge, I ran the U.S. office for 2 Chinese venture capital firms that were investing cross-border between the U.S. and China, so I have a little bit of experience here. In terms of what I've observed, especially in some of the areas that we focus on, which is big data, AI, and semiconductors, especially the last topic, I think a lot of the U.S.-China challenges are creating huge issues for our companies. My partners have been in Washington, D.C. to brief dozens of people, literally, from CFIUS on a handful of occasions for portfolio companies of ours that have been going through various strategic activities related to China, as well as the fact that we're actually seeing now, I think, a lot of cooling off, and I think Rebecca talked about that, of both investment and I think now commercial activity between the US and China. And the commercial activity is more recent. That's happened more or less over the last 6 to 9 months. And that's created some significant challenges. I'd say the investment slowdown has certainly been difficult, but if you're a successful company and you have a lot of interested parties to invest, it's a minor bump along the road. If you're looking for M&A, maybe you'll get a lower offer because there's less competition for your company. But now, especially in some of these markets where China, especially if you're a semiconductor company, is probably the largest market for your product, and there are not only challenges in exporting your product to China, but now, more recently, a lot of the hardware companies from China are taking active steps to remove American products, American suppliers from their supply chains. That makes it even more challenging. So we are starting to look at effectively moving some of our companies to neutral countries for the purpose of being able to sell into China, putting aside the M&A and investment side, just the ability to do business. And I think that's significant. The second is having the majority of my colleagues in Europe. We're also seeing a significant amount of FDI that would have ordinarily, I would imagine, be earmarked here for the US from China moving into Europe. Huawei, for instance, has a massive operation in the UK, thousands of people there, very little challenges in working with China. The broader EU is the same. And so I think there still will be investment reviews and whatnot that you would expect that would be customary, but they're not at the level that we're seeing today. And so I think in some ways, and we see this even in some of these portfolio companies where we'll have a portfolio company in Europe and a portfolio company in the US, both want to do business in China. The European company is just having a much easier time. And I think that will be the case for the foreseeable future, unfortunately. And I think we're taking steps to try to moderate that so that our companies can successfully operate.
Very interesting.
Hi. Oh, is this on? We can just pass this one down the line. Hi there. My name is Nick Adams. I work with Jerry Yang, who obviously founded Yahoo, and about 7 years ago we founded a venture firm focusing on data-driven companies and infrastructure and all kinds of new kinds of frontier technologies and things here in the US mostly. We don't actually invest a lot in China, probably unfortunately. I remember in 2014 I went to meet with the head of the investment side of DGI, and Jerry said, should we invest? And I said, well, it's kind of expensive, and we're not really investing in China, so probably not. And that was obviously a big mistake. But you know, my perspective on what is going on is, you know, I grew up in the UK. So by the way, my background is engineering. I studied engineering. I went and spent 2 years in India and then 3 years in China, learned Chinese. I worked for Edward Tian, who started China Netcom, and then CBC Capital. And so, you know, my mother's American, my dad's English. I grew up in Scotland. I'm now in America. I spent time in China and India. My idea of the whole trade war is just completely ridiculous. As a global citizen, I think that it's inevitable, this sort of trend towards globalization. But about 1.5 years ago, I woke up and sort of realized, you know, if you're in Washington and you do nothing for the next 20 years, suddenly it's very obvious that China's going to hold all the cards, right? So something has to be done. It's like one of these movies where you can kind of see this tragedy happening, and you can see how both sides have to do a certain thing, but it's going to end up in the sort of the same situation anyway, and it may actually escalate that situation. What I mean by that is that the officials in Washington, and by the way, Trump has actually not a lot of pushback from the Democratic side on what he's doing. Isn't that interesting? And that's one of the observations I have. A lot of Democrats hate Trump, but no one pushes back on the idea that the trade war is a good thing, and maybe the way he's doing it is bad. So there's this kind of idea that we have to do something. And I was with Eric Yuan from Zoom, who's one of our portfolio companies, a few weeks ago. And you know, Eric was saying, look, China's kind of like a startup, right? This country is new, it's running fast and hard, and America's kind of like this big incumbent, kind of like Cisco. You know, he's the Zoom, China's the Zoom, and America's like the Cisco. And they're going to try and put pressure on China, right? They're going to have to in a way, right? It's the only thing they can do. They can't buy China, right? The problem is that's going to make China work harder in all the areas that we're putting pressure on them. And I think that what's going to happen is, I don't blame what the government is doing, but the inevitable outcome is that it may actually accelerate China's rise in many different areas. And I think that's very fascinating. One of the examples you can watch of the microcosm of what happened between Didi and Uber a few years ago, someone earlier mentioned that Uber listed Uber as one of the companies that failed in China. I completely disagree. If you look at what happened, Uber pushed really hard in China, spent a lot of money. Actually, that forced Didi to work even harder, to innovate faster, to have a bigger vision. And then Uber ended up with, I think, 15 or 20% of Didi, which is an incredible win for them. And then just as a final point, that's interesting because now Uber's kind of an investor in a Chinese company. And just today we have this news the US wants to restrict investment in Chinese companies, and kind of Americans winning from Chinese growth, which I think is, again, kind of sad and a bit of a mistake, but you can see why they have to do it. So it's kind of like this whole thing's playing out a bit like a movie. You can see why both parties are acting the way they are. I think the outcome may be counter to what America intends, but you know, so be it, and we probably will wake up in 20 years anyway, and China will hold most of the cards.
My name is Dixon Doll. I am, been involved in China for probably better than just about 15 years. We started up over there, what was called originally Doll Capital Management, and it's now known as Dixon Ventures. I went emeritus from there a few years ago, and I want to just use this opportunity to really plug Rebecca's book, because she explains in all kinds of detail in here, and I just got it yesterday, but it's a great book. And I think that nobody's ever going to regret reading it, and I think you're going to learn a lot from it. And thank you for doing such a great job, Rebecca.
Thank you, Dixon. You know, it's all about the community and all of you that I'm able to do what I do.
The other acknowledgement I wanted to make is that Eric Savitz just made a very brief reference to some of the statistics, but I think it's important that you look at the statistics even briefly to find out how there's been a huge turning point, and probably everybody knows it, but they put some of the numbers behind it. It's plummeted. The number of dollars. In 2018, China was 38% of the global investment in BC. It just fell off the cliff last year. I don't think it's getting much better now. I mean, I've talked to a whole bunch of people, friends of mine in the Valley and so on, that have tried to raise money from China, it's virtually impossible these days unless you have some extremely special and unique conditions. And I think that's one of the big problems that we're going to have to get over. I think I think that things can turn around, because in my experiences, when I was first starting in China, I was actually on a Chinese government committee to help them figure out what they needed to do to get venture capital going. That was when I was with the NBCA as the chairman, and so we told them, a lot of the critical success factors that had come to pass in getting the U.S. to be, one of the world leaders, if not the world leader in VC. And they listened, and they were very, very serious about it. But just the shifting political tides there caused them to somehow forget or lose sight of the important things that it's going to take to build a vibrant venture ecosystem. What I'm absolutely convinced of is that there are a lot of important people in the Chinese government that know what needs to be done. I'm not sure if anybody has the political will to go fight the battles with some of the other politicians there to take some of the moves that they need to make in order to get a vibrant venture ecosystem going again. It's just well known that that in every country in the world that has created a vibrant venture ecosystem, it's stimulated the economy, created a lot of jobs, and made for better trade relationships and so on. There's no lack of blame to go around. I don't want to blame China totally for that, because we've got our own problems here in the U.S. But there's just a lot of improvements that China needs to make, like in the areas of improving their capital markets, their stock exchanges, their transparency, and their IP protection to foreign vendors, just to mention a few things. And when they get serious about that, then they're going to really be able to move forward and become a much bigger and more important player in the industry than they are today, and as everybody knows they could be. But that's got to get sorted out through the political wings. So I know that the Chinese government knows this, but that they need to do this, and I think that they will get that figured out sooner or later. Certainly the United States is not setting a great example by doing the CFIUS thing that everybody knows about, which essentially prohibits Chinese companies from buying American companies that have important technologies without a whole lot of bureaucracy and all that kind of stuff. And we need to have better protection of the intellectual property, as many of you know as well. But I'm convinced that the winds are going to change, and somehow that cooler heads will prevail, and that some more visionary people will get involved, and the politics will at least moderate. I don't think they're ever going to go away, but I'm very excited about the future of seeing some of these artificial barriers go away, and I hope that that we can see much more cooperation between our two great countries, the way a lot of us would like to see it. I want to next introduce, and maybe we're going to have some chance for additional remarks, but I want to introduce my good friend Carmen Chang here before it gets too late. And she's been a great friend for a long time. Spent her time in China as well as here in the U.S. and done a great job. Nice to see you again.
Yes. Yeah, thanks, Carmen. That's great. There were so many good remarks here, but one thing I wanted to focus on is you talked about, and I think, Nick, it was you who talked about how we're pushing back and China becoming more reliant on its own technologies as a result. And I just wonder, what do the panelists think should China's strategy be? What should China's strategy be? What should the U.S. strategy be toward China? Should we have Should we have a more proactive stance? Should we have a technology fund that is government directed like China does? Should we have a made in US 2025? Should we have an Internet Plus? Should we have a Belt and Road initiative with our neighbors instead of alienating them? What should the U.S. be doing? And Dixon, you said you're very positive on you, and Carmen said she's very positive on the U.S., but we still see China's rise. So what should the U.S. be doing to make sure that we continue to be the leader? Nick, let's start with you.
I'll just briefly, I mean, I agree, Dixon. I mean, I don't think this government sort of support of technology necessarily has a great, especially financial support really has a massive impact. We have a lot of assets in the US. The way we do business, sort of capitalist first mentality, the openness of knowledge. And I, when I said I thought that China might hold the cards in 20 years, I guess what I meant is perhaps on aggregate, when you look at the numbers, there's more dollars being created, but it may not matter at that point. I think, there's so much interchange between the US and China in terms of knowledge and technology and capital. The governments are trying to unweave them a little bit, but I think eventually the capital markets will figure out a way to weave things back together again. We live in one world where the success of one country will depend on another, and the whole idea of countries may not matter that much anyway. It may not matter right now. It just maybe a previous generation wants to kind of keep it that way. So I'm pretty positive. I don't think the U.S. needs to do anything specifically different. We just need to keep attracting the top talent from around the world. That's one thing China does not have, let's face it. If you're born in Italy and you're a top mathematician, you want to do deep learning, you're not going to China for sure. That said, Carmen mentioned sort of semiconductors. I do think that there is some play where if the government in China decides in the next 10 years we really need to at least build some independence and maybe then leadership in semi, there are a certain number of people within NVIDIA, let's say, who are Chinese, and when you throw a lot of money at them, will move back and have a life in China. There's an argument to say, well, they wouldn't want the pollution and they're scared of the government oversight. Maybe they're too Americanized and they wouldn't want to go back. I don't know. The jury's out on that, but there's definitely a play where money can make a difference. But yeah, that's kind of my high level.
Yeah, so first of all, I think I agree with what Nick and Carmen said, especially about how strong the U.S. is. I do believe that China is spending a lot of capital to fund especially areas of semiconductor innovation. It is impossible for China to catch up to the U.S. Overnight. Especially in semiconductors, and Carmen knows better than anybody how hard that could be. But I think that they are trying, and it will be a multi-year process. What that means, though, to Nick's point, is that at some point in time, there will be a domestic industry that will be able to provide that sort of hardware underpinning for a lot of these new technologies. And I think you talked about it, Rebecca, in your comments earlier about sense time and some of these other sort of monitoring type technologies where in China privacy rights are different, and so the ability to generate high amounts of data is very high, images, et cetera. And so you're able to train AI actually probably faster than you can in the US because we have fewer cameras catching where we are and those sorts of things. So I think that China will have, and 5G, for instance, is I think going to roll out faster in China. So I think you have some good trends that will help China actually stay quite competitive. But I do agree that it's a long process, and I think to your question originally of what can the U.S. do, I actually think it sort of runs counter to some of what we're hearing in the press today. Putting aside the investment restrictions, which may or may not stay in place, and we can talk about whether there's pluses and minuses of that, I think the fact is that a lot of innovators are probably not going to be coming here in the future because of the way the U.S. is behaving. And unfortunately, a lot of people come here who are brilliant, stay here because they enjoy the quality of life and they appreciate the freedoms here. So that's what I would hope, is that if we do, these other, I think there are some reasons to do certain things in terms of restrictions and monitoring of investments. It's probably too much right now, But I definitely think that the biggest loss for the US will be big brains that just aren't going to come here, or they're going to come here and move back to where they are. And remember, China isn't the only place where people immigrate here and create huge companies. Other countries also send some of their best and brightest and have created other phenomenal companies out here. And my biggest fear is that those people don't come, or they go back home after they get educated here.
Great. So I think I'm thinking about the other side of the coin from Carmen's point. So if I compare U.S. to China in the startup world, so far the U.S. has the lead in the R&D. Major technologies still come out of U.S. and major business models are still come out of U.S. And then the Chinese are leading in certain sectors, but their innovation are mostly reflected from some maybe marginal business model improvements. So one example is over the last few years, we look at the cases from US and China both. And then every time we have IC meetings in China, most of the cases are, look, we have this business idea, we can do better in channel marketing, in certain sales. We have a model that's faster. But occasionally you see a pitch that's, look, we have a disruptive technology, we want to do whatever. And then most likely the founders are from the US, the overseas returnees. So on the other hand, in Silicon Valley, there are a lot of technology disruption cases. So in that, I agree with Carmen's assessment. So US is a very strong, has great capacity in great innovations, big innovations. But I also see that the synergies that Rebecca mentioned earlier between the two economies, if I look at certain areas, China are leading, I can mention a few. E-commerce in some sectors of e-commerce, social, and maybe some video, short form videos, then mobile payment and paid contents, right? In some of these areas, China are leading. So for me,
do you think the U.S. is going to get it together with those kind of new areas?
I feel, for me, this is a very interesting advantage, maybe a slight edge for me. So I think some of this can be applied to the U.S. So I sometimes consciously looking out for the startups that may be doing some of the stuff in the sectors. And I sometimes use China example as their references.
Okay, all right. Dixon, do you want to add? Just pass the mic down. Dixon, do you want to add?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, okay, there's a mic right here.
Sorry, okay.
Yeah, there you go.
I just wanted to say one thing because we've had a lot of discussions about, what role does the government play on this? Being involved in the NVCA for quite a few dozen years, I remember and I know some of the founders that started the National Venture Capital Association in the U.S. Are now very long in the tooth. I mean, they're in their 80s and 90s, they're still alive. But one of the sacred principles that we always adhered to was that we do not want to have the venture capital industry be dependent upon moves that are made by the government. We wanted to have a good relationship with them and educate them, very far and wide so that we never played any surprises or games on them, but it was a cardinal rule, and I would say that that is extremely relevant to this discussion today, that the government should not play an excessive role. And I'm going to cite one example of this in my own experience. Back when China was going, through their efforts to get venture capital starting, the mayors flooded some of their cities there with new innovation zones and incubators and government-backed VC funds, and many of those incubators became incinerators.
Carmen. Yeah, okay. Good. Let's end it there because we have raised a number of really important points that I'm sure you'll want to discuss with the audience here, and as we enjoy our cocktails and our appetizers. And so we're going to end it there, and let's give our venture capitalists a round of applause, please. And please join us as the tour continues. Our next stop, actually, I'm going to be in Washington, D.C. on October 10 and speaking at the Brookings Institution, and 300 people have already signed up for that. So I know D.C. is very important in this story. Yeah, and you know, it's interesting what you said about the government thing, but you know, because of this China issue
But
now,
they
the
have
government is getting involved
They have
again
a
in
role to
venture
play.
capital.
They do, but it has to not be an active one, you know.
Well, it's getting more active, I think, yeah, certainly on the investment side too, the FDI, tech investment in the U.S. So I hope you'll enjoy the drinks. Thank you all for coming. And, you know, if you're in Washington, October 10, join us there. I'm in Shanghai, November 4, and I'm in Hong Kong, let's see, November 14th, November 6th, November 7th. There's a lot of stops along the way. I'm in London, October 21st, 22nd, 23rd. This is a real global book tour I'm on, and I'm only about 1/3 of the way through. So I hope you're following us on Facebook and Silicon Dragon Ventures. And if you didn't get your book, I'm going to go back over there and sign some more books. So thank you again. Take care.